I was listening to that announcement you made about the Emerge podcast this
Mm.
morning, actually.
Mm.
Just thinking about, so you saying that you're changing direction a little bit, perhaps from exploring, what was the phrase you used? Say systems and systems transformation with a grounding in, say, personal development, and then perhaps looking at it from the other direction, like going more into actually personal development in the context of the fact that we're going through systems change. I was wondering, like, maybe it would be an interesting topic to just explore first, is like, why this sense of a need for personal development, for, say, leveling up humanity and how we express ourselves as humans within this time. And as you said, I don't know if you have all the answers to that, but I've got some thoughts and you got some thoughts.
Sure.
With that.
Yeah. So why the focus on personal development or personal change? Yeah. Well, so one thing that I think I'm really fascinated by, and this is probably to some degree my Buddhist training, is that it seems obvious to me and to many people that there is this dichotomy between systems change and personal transformation. And yet I also have the sneaking suspicion that it's a false dichotomy, right? That it's like an artifact of our misperception that we even separate the two at all. And in fact, we can sort of like acknowledge that this system, which I think that you and I kind of agree has some fundamental issues that we need to kind of work out with some degree of urgency, because the biosphere isn't like waiting to unravel; it's unraveling now. The system that is currently the problem has already been that which has constructed us. So the mind that is attempting to find a way out is the very mind that was built, or the very human, that was built by the system which is self-terminating. And so there's this kind of like recursive chicken and egg problem when we think about systems change and personal development. And so, in any case, like the conversations I had on the podcast have always been like looking in, kind of refracting through a side, but always acknowledging that you can't talk about one without the other, that there is a way in which they're deeply together. They are not separate. And that I think the attempt to do systems change without changing our perception, changing our perspective, is itself like deeply misguided in some fundamental way, which I can't even really express. It's more of like a felt sense. And similarly, like the idea that we can somehow just atomize ourselves and change ourselves over here without a relationship to the larger system and the systems that we're embedded in, that also is, well, first of all, feels very boring to me, but then also I think is just not like a real thing. It's kind of like a bad thought. It's like not actually how things work in the world. So yeah, that's kind of like where I'm at. And with the shift in the podcast, it was kind of like noticing that I was sitting over here with the kind of in the personal change, kind of reaching out to the systems change, if we're going to maintain this dichotomy. And now I'm kind of moving over with the view that I have generated through all these conversations, speaking with people like some of whom you're speaking with, that I now have of like, okay, like this is the flavor, the taste, the texture of the world that we want to create together. Like, how then do we then look back on what is possible in terms of personal transformation from that new view? And so that's kind of the shift. It's for me, I experience it as being quite subtle, but it also will result, I think, in quite different conversations going forward.
I mean, something that's coming to mind for me while you were speaking there is this sense that human beings, we are ourselves systems that exist within systems. We're a system of thoughts and recurrent emotional patterns, and indeed bodily systems, gastro systems, fluids and electricity moving around us all the time. And there isn't a line between that system and the external. system, really, other than say the skin and what we can feel. But like, if I didn't eat this morning, then I would be grouchy now. If I didn't have friends and family and loved ones around me, then I'd be a hell of a lot more miserable than I am now. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for the fact that we both exist within some kind of shared system within one another. And it makes me think perhaps even to this idea that we've lived under this idea of, say, perhaps individualism for quite a long time, that people are autonomous rulers of this own kingdom that begins here and ends there. And that legitimizes a lot of the economic structures we live under as well, because the people who are most effective at ruling that kingdom from here to here are those who get to win. But when you pick it apart, it's not so simple. There's that phrase, man is legion, for example, which I really like. And I think that really speaks to the matter. Like, each one of us is many competing sub-personalities, and some of them are oriented towards, might be called, the true and the good and the beautiful, and some of them are not. And understanding that and getting just a feel for that before even really trying to go in and incise on it and change it, but just understanding how all these pieces are working and where there's conflict between them and where there's harmony. It matters. And it seems from that perspective now like artificial to draw that line between what happens here and what happens out there, because one's a microcosm of the other.
And what comes to mind, and this is, I think, something that Zach Stein has really clarified for me, who I know you've had on the show recently. It's like, I sometimes think about it in terms of like maladaptive software that's been installed. We can play with a way of looking that sees that there is no such individual, or no such thing as an individual, right? And that can be very useful to kind of see the situation in a new way, perhaps. It can also be very useful to see that there are individuals, like that I'm talking to you, and that can help us kind of reflect or refract the situation in a different way. And so one of my kind of operating assumptions is that sort of flexibility in how we look is actually the kind of meta move that's most important, that we can, say, operate from the perspective of the human. And in the case that you're speaking about, like, what comes to mind is liberal humanism, and the way in which this kind of philosophical, almost like it is a kind of metaphysics. It's a claim about the way the world works, right? So the way that I render it is like, liberalism is this idea that we ought to design an economic system that more or less is oriented towards satisfying human preferences, right? That and humanism is, like you said, is something like that man is the measure of all things. And so you look at that kind of core operating system, which for me was so deeply embedded into my psychology and my organism that it's taken me years to even sort of be able to peer out of it. And you kind of collectivize that, and you see, of course, we're destroying the planet. Of course, we're destroying the planet if you take those two core assumptions. And it also kind of comes down and creates this sense of, other things create this too, but of me being over here, you being over there, me somehow having some kind of separate, apart existence from the systems that I'm embedded in. And so I think it's really helpful to look at what are the assumptions and ways of seeing that perhaps are constellating the problem, like you say. Like, it's not so simple. We need to spend perhaps almost all of our time actually getting clear about the situation and the problem space, and less of it acting, I think, because to act with a misunderstanding of what the problem actually is quite likely to just create new problems that we then have to solve. Oh, I can't hear you. I don't know if that's me. Still can't hear you. You can hear me though. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, you got me?
Yep.
Okay. Now I have to try and remember that thread. Yeah, I mean, what am I thinking? Conflict that exists within people that so often then ends up getting projected outwards is fascinating, and perhaps one of those real interesting insights, say, of the depth psychology movement, that often the parts of self that we are most uncomfortable with, we will identify in those around us and really pick on. So, I mean, I can talk from experience, having at times felt like I've been just out of control with certain destructive behavior patterns, consumptive behavior patterns. And then when I see that happening, I see someone else engaging in that, there's like a real visceral disgust to it. It's like, dude, why are you doing that? And when we're talking about this personal development growth stuff, I mean, that's such a broad umbrella, but I think, well, a big part of it for me recently has been like understanding these points of conflict, and then trying to just like, if the conflict can't be gotten rid of, then at least get rid of some of the feelings of frustration or guilt around the fact that conflict exists. I'm actually not entirely sure where I'm going with that. Have you got anything you can riff with there?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a kind of sophistication that I think that you're referring to, which in my world, so part of the reason why I made this shift in the podcast is also because I live at this place called the Monastic Academy, and there I'm doing a lot of work to design curriculum, and the stated purpose of the curriculum is to create what we sometimes call awakened leaders, but essentially you can unpack that to mean people who have the capacity to lean into the world in such a way that it kind of bends toward justice, bends toward goodness, constructs the more beautiful world our hearts tell us is possible. And so there's this ongoing inquiry about how do we create those people? What does it mean to create those people? And when I hear you speak about how you have this kind of reflexivity about what it means to judge another, that for me is like a kind of almost like a core component of that sort of person, right? That and I mean, we do a practice called circling at, and you're familiar with circling. It's like a relational meditation practice at Maple Monastic Academy, and one of the teachers there has brought this fantastic little add-on practice within circling, which is called mirror swords. And so we typically have like a sign, like if this is audio, you can't see it, but I'm holding my hand in such a way that I can indicate you, right? And so I say, like, I have a mirror sword for you. And that means like a judgment that I have about you, but that I know that I then hold up the mirror, because it also means that I have that judgment about me. Right? And this is like a very, as you say, like a Jungian sort of, this goes way back, but that we can even see that, I think, is a huge innovation in human consciousness, because most people are just totally blind to the way that they project that out into the world, right? And how much peacefulness and coherence can we generate by owning our projections, but then also like by sharing them with each other so that we can all grow, if that's the stated intention. So that's like, I love that kind of thing. I love it because not just to see, oh, I'm judging you, I must have that part inside of me, and I probably have a kind of messed up relationship with it. But then also to either tell other people, because that's like a courageous thing to do and quite beautiful, I think, but also to be told, for somebody to care enough about you to give you their nasty shit, their nasty judgments. It's like, I experience that as being such a gift and so beautiful when people care enough about me to tell me how they like see, are judging the hell out of me. And for me, that's increasingly, I see that as like a core capacity of these kinds of people that we want to create, is like the courage and willingness to be transparent about these kind of things, instead of, as is very common in spiritual circles, kind of just like hiding them and maybe doing the work yourself a little bit, but like, I don't want to be seen as judgmental. I don't want to be seen as having these tendencies. Yeah, that's what that brings up to me. Yeah,
there's something very liberating about being able to show those,
oh my God,
less, what would I call them? It's not less desirable, but like less normally socially acceptable sides of self to others. And it's I've been thinking a lot recently around this idea of perfection and this standard of perfection that I think to some degree, well, I don't know if I can say everybody because I don't know, but I certainly have walked around with it inside my head. Like, I think there's a deep unconscious sense of like having to be perfect, and having to be perfect means having to like everybody and be totally at peace in every situation, and manifest a kind of goodness and trust and love towards everybody. But the issue is, if that just leads to you being inauthentic and holding back, then it's missing something. And there is that freedom that comes with opening that space up and really being able to just own in company the fact that we have nasty bits. I'm reminded of a conversation we had with Ian McGilchrist a few months back. And one of the things that stuck in my head was, he said, as a psychiatrist, one of the things that he just heard and was fascinated by over and over again was how many people on a deep level really believe that they're perfect and that they have to be perfect. But how much inner conflict and, as a result, outer conflict gets produced as a result of the fact that things don't really match up with that idea. And I guess where my thought has gone recently is like, well, if it is a correct statement to say that there seems to be something that exists within, what would you say, the unconscious makeup of at least a lot of us, is this idea of perfection. Where does that come from? How did we learn that idea? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's a fair judgment of people to have?
Oh boy.
Description of psychic makeup?
Well, I mean, I can certainly, I'll speak for myself because I don't have a lot of training in this area, but I've been, sometimes I use the 4-facet model from integral philosophy to talk about like human development. So I've been doing a lot of what is called in that model cleaning up recently, like working with shadow material, sort of like what we've been talking about a little bit. And I've noticed for me that my drive to perfection is constellated as a response to a deep feeling of inadequacy, worthlessness, and brokenness, right? That there's this kind of like feeling belief that I'm worthless, that I'm somehow fundamentally broken, and that like that got encrusted over with this compensatory drive towards appearing to be perfect and smart and competent. And yeah, I mean, it's been a ball and chain that I've been wearing for most of my life. And it's only recently, as I've kind of gotten underneath it, to look at these sort of wounds or these beliefs, that I felt a little bit liberated by it. But I in my model, I think, as I'm speaking, I'm realizing this, in my model, I imagine, or I believe that those who feel that like intense drive to perfection also have in them this deep wound of inadequacy, worthlessness, something like that. And So that I noticed that having that perspective generates a lot of compassion, both for myself in those instances, but also for others who I see operating from that perspective.
Yeah.
How about you? I'm curious what you feel about it, or like what's
well, no, I think that resonates. I mean, where I've been thinking is more from the actual. I've been thinking about it in terms of religion and spiritual worldviews, actually. And where my wondering is that is it some kind of hangover from seeing existence through like a kind of two world lens, in that there is the perfect divine sphere and then the fallen, sinful, corrupt human world, and just wondering if, you know, use the word software earlier in the conversation, if that software has been run by people for thousands of years, we may say, at least hundreds, at least a couple of thousand years.
Yeah.
And then even if perhaps we no longer consciously adhere to the idea that this is the world of original sin. I'm lapsing into Christian language, but we're in the West. We're no longer, we're still in that world, and that there is the transcendent world that exists somewhere, but it's not accessed through church anymore. I mean, even perhaps it tacks itself onto that mythology of liberal humanism, like that perfect world exists in that place you can get to if you just
buy the right things. Sort yourself out, buy the right things. Yeah. I think there's a lot to what you're saying. I think it's there's so many different ways of looking at this, and I think I haven't yet explored as much as I ought to the sort of Christian roots of some of these ideas, but it must be the case, right, that like that original sin is functioning in my consciousness to a greater degree, and our consciousness to a greater degree than we think. And I think, you know, in general though, like what also comes up for me is that within the sort of more spiritual milieu, there's this very kind of this platitude that everything is perfect, right? Like, and you should acknowledge that everything is perfect. Spiritually, everything is perfect. And to a certain degree, if you could just see that, you would be happy and chill and whatever. And again, what comes to mind is what we really want to cultivate is a flexibility in ways of seeing, because it's really awesome to see that everything is perfect. It's excellent. It's an excellent way to see things, that you are already perfect, that nothing needs to be done, that perfection is like an imminent experience that is just available to you right now if you just stop struggling. Right? That's awesome, really profoundly beautiful. And also, like, shit is mad broken, and we have to work our asses off to fix it. And I want to be around people who can like oscillate skillfully between those two and many other ways of seeing the situation, because that's really, for me, like that's the key. That's the dance, is like, can we like pick up and let go of these frames in order to explore usefully and be of benefit in this time of transition. It's like that, you can't get stuck. And even when I say, oh, you know, this drive to perfection has its roots in inadequacy, it's like, that's just a way of looking. That depends on a whole psychological frame that, you know, I'm not committed to. Like, that might be completely wrong way to look at it. Maybe it's better to look at it in this case more like from a Christian kind of historical construction. Or maybe it's better to look at it like from the perspective of the sacred, that we're all kind of like struggling in this schoolhouse of life to overcome those kind of what look like wounds but are actually catalysts for our own development and for the salvation of the world. Like, maybe that's more of an interesting and useful way to look at it. I don't know, but I want to be around people who like also don't know and want to play like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking now of the last chapter of Zach Stein's book that I read because of your podcast. And you know the last chapter, right? I presume, where he's talking.
Remind me
about. So the book's on education for people listening, and the last chapter is really about spiritual education. And he quotes a bunch from Slavoj Zizek's writing on Western Buddhism, and Zizek's argument that in some sense, a certain form of Buddhism has become the religion par excellence of capitalism. For the very fact that it pretty much teaches accept accept the way things are. Be at peace with it. Life is suffering, but you can transcend it if you just let go of your desires, which is kind of funny given that, I mean, as you've already pointed out, like the paradigm we live under is all about the satisfaction of desires and a kind of weird sense of transcendence through achieving and chasing desire.
Yeah, I love his critique. I mean, this is very strong language. He calls it, I think, the hegemonic ideology of late capitalism, which that's pretty caustic. That's pretty radical. And yeah, I mean, what comes to mind is just like, I know so many people. Okay, wait, let me make sure this is a fair assessment. I used to live in Boulder, Colorado, very much a center for spirituality in America. And it was common for people to be Buddhist and just consume so much stuff. Go to Whole Foods, participate in this whole emerging economy. And there's something that feels to me very tricky about this area. It's like, I did it too. And I used Buddhism, I used these practices to kind of numb out and to chill while participating in if I really ask myself, if I'm really honest with myself, are systems that are destroying the planet. And so there's something more here than just, there's got to be something more here than just feeling good and feeling at peace and giving up some of our desires for our own well-being. And it's, I don't know what else to say other than I really feel resonant with that concern that Slavoj Zizek has. I don't think he gives enough credit to Buddhism. I think like Western Buddhism is a kind of particular synthesis of Buddhism that is, or the Western Buddhism that he was critiquing is a particularly problematic strain of Buddhism. It doesn't have to be like that, and Buddhism itself isn't any particular way. But
yeah, well, I'm interested in perhaps the contrast between spiritual practices that seem to be about escaping and transcending the world versus ones that seem to be about optimizing yourself for actually being in the world. No, I think you get strands of that within all religions. I mean, it reminds me, it goes back to that point I was making, perhaps that is again my thinking around that two-world mythology. If you're constantly wrapped up in the sense that there is the perfect sphere and we're not in it, and the way to get there, well, I don't know if it's through spiritual practice, but it's through something, but you're never quite there. And so there's always a kind of inability to be fully present with the here and now, perhaps. Although that's interesting, because then I think of the mindfulness movement, which seems to have taken the practices out of the East and removed them of their spiritual bent. And then it's like, well, it's all about learning to be in the here and now. But I think that also loses something. So now we're back to your multi-perspectivalism again.
Yeah, so it's so tricky. And this is why I spend so much of my time kind of quote unquote trying to figure out, right? Like, how do we deploy what John Vervaeke would call like an ecology of practices in such a way that it actually resolves some of these like maladaptive conditionings and ways of looking, such that we can be liberated to participate in this time between worlds. Like, what does that look like? And it is not easy. It's not easy. And there's so many ways in which these practices these technologies can, instead of liberating that possible future version of ourselves, become reduced into something that reifies and gives permission to some of that maladaptive conditioning. And it's like very, 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 very tricky. Each time that I think I have or typically when I think that I know what it will take, I later find that I was actually like doing the very thing that I was just saying, kind of like taking a partial perspective and like wanting it to be a certain way. And it's endlessly fascinating to me and endlessly humbling.
I've been spending some time more recently in the kind of circles of Alexander Bard, the philosopher, who it's interesting because he seems to be in this space, but then also with a kind of a different angle on it. I think he seems to be having this spirituality around creativity and creating a sense of a grand narrative. I mean, I suppose one of his big points is we need a grand narrative again, which, well, it's interesting to observe that he seems to get under the skin of some of the more American, like Anglo-Saxon people in this space who there's a sense that actually grand narratives are over and that we need this like meta-modern multi-perspectivalism, but also like to chill out and let emerge rather than trying to like push through it. I don't know if I'm doing the best justice to this perspective here, but there is that, it's an interesting dichotomy that's going on there. And I'm fascinated by the fact that there seems to be some rivalry. Like, for example, I've heard Alexander refer to the kind of stuff that a bunch of you North Americans doing. He's like, they're doing good stuff, but ultimately they're just sitting around in circles talking.
Which people? Who's he?
So I would think the neurohacker collective guys, the rebel wisdom guys. So
like the collective intelligence stuff.
Yes, exactly. That stuff.
Yeah.
Like, John Vervaeke as well. Like, I think, in fact, the language he's used is like they're working on the will to intelligence, but not the will to transcendence, which is to actually build that which comes next, as opposed to just, he would use the phrase talking about what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And we need to talk about what comes next before we build it. And we probably should, talk about it well. And when that tipping point comes, I think is, different people have different sensibilities around that. And also, like, I kind of agree. I mean, that's why I live where I live. I feel like I am, in fact, building and participating in creating what comes next, which, we could get into that. But, I also would, I talk a lot about kind of perspectival flexibility and meta-perspectival flexibility. At the same time, if all of that flexibility is not in service of a grand narrative, so to speak, then like it feels quite masturbatory, right? And I think that grand narrative is implicit in things like the Neurohacker Collective, right? But we can make it explicit. The world is on fire. Leverage your perspective. Choose perspectives accordingly, right? This is the time to show up. This is the time when we need heroes. You ought to become a hero. Use your perspectival flexibility to create or recreate yourself as a hero. And that for me is the creative impulse, right? Is that we now get to decide, and it's hard, we can do it, to create ourselves into these heroic individuals who can stand forth and attempt to do the impossible, the seemingly impossible of what Jordan Greenhalgh calls threading the eye of the needle and actually coming out the other side of this in a way that we're better off than when we started. And that is exciting to me. That for me, like, fills me with, libido, as Alexander Bard might call it.
Yeah, that felt good, Daniel. That felt passionate. I liked it.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I care really almost the most about, I think, in the world. Is this kind of thing.